Let's now talk about the client structure and functionality, now that we've walked through the server side of things. And this, of course, is going to focus on the side that's making the requests asynchronously. And you'll see, relative to what we had talked about last time when we talked about how to program this using Spring Web MVC, we're going to have a very new and improved version that's going to use the features available from Spring 6 and beyond that deal with the HTTP interface client. So to do this, we're going to make ourselves an interface called LockAPI. And this is going to hide all the details of having to do remote method invocation using HTTP. And it's, for my money, cleaner and more streamlined and more intuitive than the Retrofit version that we've looked at before. So you can see we've got a bunch of methods here, which correspond roughly to what's on the server side. In fact, you could generate this automatically if you had the controller logic. It's not hard at all. These also provide some really cool features that you don't get with Retrofit, although there are some limitations as well, but generally it's pretty cool for what we're doing here. As you can see, by using HTTP interface clients, we can have reactive types baked right in there, so that's really nice. Most of these things return monos to booleans or locks, with the exception of this acquire method, which returns a flux, because we're getting multiple permits. They also have some annotations that are very similar to what you have on the controller side, just that it says post or get exchange rather than post or get mapping. That's the only main difference. Here are the names that we give these methods. They need to correspond to the endpoint handler route names that are available on the server side. And then also a very nice feature in HTTP interface client with Spring 6 and beyond is the ability to use the same annotations that we have on the Spring controller. So you can see here we have request body, request param, and so on and so forth. And these mirror what's shown on the server side. So before we go any further, let's take a look at how you make an instance of this LockAPI. So what you do is you typically would have some kind of a component, as you can see here. And this is client beans. And we've got a bean in here. And the bean is going to be the get LockAPI method. Doesn't really matter what it's called. The key thing is it returns a LockAPI. So by having this as a bean, then anywhere we need the LockAPI, this is the method that will be called automatically to do that. And that's very easy to do. You're familiar with that by now. So let's then take a closer look at the actual implementation logic for this thing. There's something called a web client. You can read about it here at this link. We'll show a lot of that stuff. You'll need to be able to use this for the upcoming programming assignment. So pay particular careful attention to this example because it's very relevant for what you'll be doing. So we say web client builder. So we make a builder for a web client. We say base URL. So we give it the LockManager server's base URL. In this particular case, because it's a simple test case, we're hard coding the port number and an address of the server. Normally, you would use Eureka or some kind of discovery service to do this, but that was overkill for this simple example. We then say build, and that makes us a web client that will know how to contact the LockManager service at this URL. And this will work. This web client that we just made here is going to work for both synchronous and asynchronous calls. So that's how it's more powerful than the REST template approach we've seen up to this point, which only worked for things that were synchronous calls. So this works for both reactive, asynchronous stuff, as well as the traditional synchronous call. And then down here, and this is just some magic you sort of have to memorize or cut and paste from examples, where we have this HTTP service proxy factory, and we make a builder, and we say, hey, please take this web client we just made up here and adapt it to work with the HTTP service proxy factory. Then you build an instance of said HTTP service proxy factory, and then you say create client, and you give it the Java class file that will create the LockAPI. So we just looked at LockAPI, which is this interface we saw that defines the actual signatures of the proxy methods that we want to be automatically generated. And this call here, create client, when given this class, will manufacture an instance of LockAPI, and that LockAPI is then passed back over to the client that's going to need it. In this case, it's just other parts of the code on the client side that need to be able to talk to the LockManager service, microservice, that's running somewhere else on another machine, in another process, and so on and so forth. And we'll take a quick look in just a moment at where that actually is used in the last part of the lesson we're going to look at. So once again, this is a very canonicalized way of creating an instance of a LockAPI and adapting it to work with web client so it can support the so-called reactive types. So that's the end of the walkthrough of the client structure and functionality. Next, we'll take a look at the test driver that puts all the pieces together.